Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening. Before I hand you over to your chair for this evening, who's Richard Sambrook, the Director of the Centre of Journalism at Cardiff University and the former Head of Global News at the BBC, I just want to remind you all to switch your phones to silent or off, please. And if you can wait for the microphone when you're asking a question, because we are broadcasting live this evening. Thank you.
Phoebe, thank you very much indeed, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here. So this evening we're here to talk about Joel Simon's new book here, The New Censorship Inside the Global Battle for Media Freedom, and you'll have spotted there'll be copies available for sale later if you're inspired by this evening's conversation. So I'm going to talk to Joel a little bit about some of the ideas in the book and some of the issues that media freedom and free speech and journalism is facing around the world at the minute. And we'll talk for about 20 minutes or so and then open it up for questions and discussion from the floor. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to get in and express your view and talk to Joel as well. Joel, of course, is the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, one of the world's leading lobby groups, NGOs, in support of free speech and media freedom around the world. And I should say, Joel, congratulations. It's a great read and an important book, I think. I wondered if we might sort of start off with a fairly wide lens and an overview of where we are. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading it is you come up with a great phrase about how at the moment we do so much celebration of digital information and news, and there's so much out there and the growth of it, and citizen journalism, and we're living in a golden age of news and information. But you make the point that all of that noise in some respects may obscure the gaps that are there. And I wonder whether you felt that's just a kind of paradox at the time we're in, or whether you think it's, actually there's so much noise it's allowing censorship to spread and grow in a way that perhaps we don't recognise.
Yeah, well, I think, well, first of all, thank you so much, Richard. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be at the Frontline Club. This is such a special place, and you are my people. This is an incredible community, and I'm just delighted to be here. So, responding to your question, so yes, that is kind of the central paradox that I explore in the book, is we live in the information age. We live in a time in history defined by information. Information is the currency of our time. It is the engine for globalization. It is the currency we need to resolve so many problems that we confront as a global community. And yet, if you look at the statistics around press freedom, or the kind of statistics that CPJ analyzes year in and year out, the number of journalists killed, the number of journalists in prison, these have reached record levels in the last couple of years. More journalists being killed, more journalists in prison than at any time that we've ever documented in our history at CPJ. And if you look at press freedom indices, press freedom is actually in decline. And there are new forms of censorship emerging. This is something I think we'll talk about. So basically, the people on the front lines who bring us the news are more vulnerable than ever. The systems that bring us the news are being weakened and eroded. And we're so blinded, we're so deluged by information that I think we fail to see the ways in which censorship and repression are actually creating gaps in the essential knowledge that we need.
So let's just explore then some of the ways that's happening. And you coin a new word in here, which I'm going to hope I get right, the democratators. Right. Is that right?
Yes.
So not dictators, but democratators. So explain the difference, and then let's talk a little bit about the kind of tactics that Turkey and Russia and Venezuela as examples.
I mean, I'm going to sort of come back to the way the technology has shifted the paradigm, and the essential way it's shifted is the power relationship, the power dynamic between journalists and the people they cover. And this plays out in all sorts of different ways in different environments, but one of the new strategies that we've seen emerge really in the last 15 years or slightly more is this system of mass repression. I call them democratators. And basically what they are is they're elected autocrats. They are leaders who are genuinely popular, who go to the polls, who compete in elections, who win those elections, and then once they gain the legitimacy conferred on them at the ballot box to amass power, they use that power to dismantle all the institutions that constrain their ability to act. chief among them is the press, because the press, in a healthy democracy, is an institution independent of government. So I look at 3 case studies in the book. I look at Vladimir Putin in Russia. I look at the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I look at the Recep Erdogan in Turkey, and I look at the ways in which they have used the systems of state control in various guises, and this kind of system is not ideological, it's really strategic, to undermine the work of the press. Just take Turkey as an example, where we've seen this evolution. So in Turkey, the first manifestation of this repressive strategy was to use anti-terror laws to prosecute journalists who engaged in critical commentary either about the Kurdish question or about this alleged conspiracy that was intended to overthrow the Erdogan government. And these laws were used to prosecute journalists. This made Turkey the world's leading jailer of journalists for a time. But the tactics have actually evolved, and I actually just recently had an opportunity to meet with President Erdogan. I was in Istanbul. And we walked in there, and actually Turkey's released a bunch of journalists, which is good news. And we wanted to talk about the strategy, and we expected this sort of pantomime that leaders go through, where they talk about the importance of press freedom and the important role that journalists play in a democracy. And he wanted none of that. As soon as we walked in the door, he went on the attack. He was hostile to the press. He doesn't need the press to govern. And the thing that was shocking, and we can come back to this, that he said that I thought was just amazing. He said, increasingly, I am against the internet every day. This is to a delegation of press freedom advocates. He's against the internet. So I can only imagine what he says in private.
So, okay, so that's Turkey. I mean, we discussed quite a lot here in the Frontline Club. We've been talking recent weeks about RT in Russia Today, and the argument, without wanting to descend into cultural theory, you'll be pleased to know, but the idea there are alternative narratives.
Sure.
And you know, this is a kind of increasingly popular view. There's no such thing as objective truth. It's all about our narrative versus your narrative, and kind of get over it, because we can put our own view of events out there. Do you think that is something that's growing? Do you think there's a legitimacy or illegitimacy around that sort of approach of saying it's just our version of the truth and we don't care if it's different from your version?
Well, if you take a step back and you look kind of at the global media environment, these state-sponsored media outlets are part of that environment, and they serve very different purposes. Some serve legitimate state interests, or interests we would accept are legitimate, and some are complex propaganda vehicles, but they're definitely part of this environment, and they're able to compete effectively because there are so many constituencies that feel underserved by the traditional media, and these outlets appeal to them. So, you know, they range from, you know, Al Jazeera and all of its networks, which, you know, I think for the most part make a very considerable contribution to the global media environment, to the Chinese state broadcaster CCTV, to the Venezuelan state broadcaster, which is operating in Latin America, to RT, which is, of course, the Kremlin-financed broadcaster, which is accountable only to Vladimir Putin. But I mean, I think that RT is the classic democratator strategy, because it's really, you know, seeking to change the narrative and to try and influence perceptions. But I think it has some resonance. I mean, you can get into this argument about, you know, competing narratives, but ultimately it has some resonance because there's a community of people around the world who feel that their views are not reflected in the traditional media and are looking for alternatives, and this is providing one.
But this politicization of journalism, of course, also has led to the issues we've seen with the Al Jazeera journalists jailed in Egypt, and you know, more people acting against journalism, or what we would here see as legitimate independent journalism, getting both sides of the story, trying to politics of it. But increasingly, journalism's becoming politicized, and that risk of falling on the wrong side of the politics is growing, isn't it? That's a growing issue.
Well, I mean, I think we'll get to this, because I know a little bit about the sort of you know, the terrorist threat. But I mean, I think that fundamentally this stems from the dynamic, which is again, looking at the relationship between journalists and the people they cover. So in societies that were repressive, international journalists in particular served a very important purpose, which was this was the primary means through which these governments could communicate with a global audience. They had to talk to the press in order to be able to achieve that, and so they tolerated the inevitable intrusions that journalists represented. That dynamic has shifted. They have many other means of communicating with the global public, including through these competing global networks, through the use of social media. They have the ability, a greater ability to put forth their own narrative without depending on journalists to the same extent. And that means that journalists are much more vulnerable. That's part of the dynamic in Egypt. Yes, there is this reality in which Al Jazeera was perceived as taking sides in that conflict, and Egypt retaliated by arresting those journalists. But in a different era, that strategy would have been self-destructive, because the political cost to Egypt of throwing international journalists in jail would have been more than that country could bear. But they decided they were going to take that on the chin. They decided they had a greater, and I think this was a decision made at the kind of level of state interest in keeping those journalists in jail, and rather than succumbing to this international campaign. It took well over a year to achieve the outcome we have today, which obviously we still have two Al Jazeera journalists facing trial and 9 journalists in prison in Egypt.
Yeah. So, the more extreme end of that, as you indicated, is with terror. And we see at the sharp end in Syria with ISIS, but of course we've also seen it in Copenhagen and so on as well, that actually, there's an increasing threat from those groups who want to use terror and use the media and use journalism as a tool in that.
Well, so when I got my start in journalism, I was a freelance journalist. I worked in Mexico. And one of the stories that I covered back in the late 90s was the rise of the Zapatista movement, which some of you may remember. This was this movement that kind of emerged on the scene in 1994. They were an indigenous group from southern Mexico. They they just emerged in these plazas. They said, we're against the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the leader was this masked rebel named Subcommander Marcos. And he was fighting the kind of cutting edge of information war in that moment. And basically, what did that mean? He engaged in this sort of agitprop, like running around with guns, basically. But really what he did was he attracted journalists, and he just, I was one of the journalists who interviewed him, and he just talked to the media and was able to use the media to convey his message to the world. Why did he do this? Because he had to. There was no other alternative. There was no other way of communicating, and so journalists were valuable to him. Now, I'm not comparing the Zapatistas to what's happening in Syria, which is completely different dynamic, but it is notable that the cutting edge of information warfare right now, as being practiced by ISIS, involves not speaking to the press, but using journalists as these horrific props in these execution videos. Now, what shifted in that time? What has shifted in this period when journalists used to identify themselves as journalists, feeling this would make them feel safer in a conflict zone, to being targets? And what's changed is not the respect for international humanitarian law, but the utility that journalists have. They are no longer useful to these groups. They're much more useful as cash machines, as props in these elaborate videos. And so that's one of the reasons we've seen this sharp increase in journalist fatalities around the world, is that journalists are increasingly targeted as a result.
And do you think we can expect to see more cases like Paris and Copenhagen, where that terror is reaching out, into cities way beyond the conflict zone?
Yeah, and again, it responds to a slightly different dynamic, which is this one. When Article 19, which is the kind of global First Amendment, it's part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When that was drafted, the language says people have the right to seek and receive information through any media and regardless of frontiers. So freedom of expression was always sort of conceived of as a transnational right. was purely notional because governments were able to exercise effective sovereignty within their own borders. But the technology that we've been talking about has made the battle for freedom of expression into a global battle, because what one country, or what is published in one country, inevitably is seen in another through this global system, which is the internet. So basically what we're seeing is a lot of these dynamics are playing out at a transnational level between governments that insist on, that have a 19th century notion of sovereignty, for example, or societies around the world that have more traditional notions of sacred personal honor. And so in some ways that's at the root of what happened in Paris, is these two value systems are coming into conflict at a global level. That's going to happen more and more, unquestionably.
So we had a session here a few weeks ago on the growth in journalists being taken hostage and kidnapped and so on. When you were on the screen there, but the communications weren't great. So I wanted to pick up on that, and particularly your view that the question of managing these hostage situations through media blackouts needs rethinking.
Yeah.
And I know you feel strongly about that. What's the issue there, and what's your...
So we're going from a sort of strategic discussion into a tactical discussion. So is that the dynamics that exist today make journalist kidnappings an attractive thing for some of these groups to do. And this is not a new phenomenon. Obviously, journalists working in conflict zones around the world have faced kidnapping for over a very long period. And who was kidnapped by Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982 and held for 7 years is probably the best example. What's actually different is the way these end. With executions. Journalists had its logic. Killing them, really did not. And so, and the new wave started with the Daniel Pearl kidnapping in Pakistan, and has evolved as the threat has moved from Pakistan to Iraq, then back to Afghanistan, to now in Syria and in Somalia and other parts of the world as well. So the way that journalists and the media industry have responded to these kidnappings in many instances is to not cover them, to black them out. This is a sort of voluntary agreement among all the media organizations. They will simply not report on these kidnappings. The logic behind this is that this blackout provides room for negotiation, where there might be negotiation in place, and that intensive coverage actually increases the value of these hostages where there's ransom being discussed. Now, the problem with this argument is there are several problems. The first is that this might have made sense during a period when these kidnappings were occasional. But there was a point in Syria, there have been 90 journalists kidnapped in Syria. There was one point where we had 30 journalists missing all at once. About half of those were international journalists. This was a huge global story with implications for the media itself. And the blackout actually obscured this reality, and I think actually heightened the risk. Secondly, there's no evidence. I don't want to take a one-size-fits-all approach, but there's very limited evidence that these blackouts actually contribute to successful outcomes. And if they don't contribute to the successful outcomes, then the media's obligation is to cover the story the same way it would cover any other story. And the third point in this particular case, when we're talking about the Islamic State, when the media does not cover these kidnappings, we basically allow the Islamic State to determine how the story is covered. They are in control of the narrative. These kidnappings are secret until they decide they're not secret. And usually when they decide they're not secret, it's when they make videos. And the purpose of the videos is to define these people as victims. We are handing the Islamic State the opportunity to define these people on their own terms. So those are my arguments.
And would you differentiate between a kidnapping by IS and there are still criminal groups? Obviously criminal kidnapping, sometimes people get passed on to the political groups, but there's a difference?
Yeah, there is a difference, and I don't think I think my real criticism is that the default has become black it out. And I think that if there is an argument that can be made that not covering, and certainly for a limited period of time, will lead to a successful outcome and save a life, then I say, we've got it. We have to take that seriously. But I think I think there's a greater likelihood that the blackout strategy will be successful. When you're talking about a pure criminal enterprise, it's just a question of agreeing on a sum. But those are actually relatively rare these days. Each case is different, but I think where we really come up short is defaulting to the blackout. I think we should default to coverage and then consider requests for blackouts on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, now I want to cover off a couple of the other areas that you raise in the book before we open it up, and we should talk a little bit about cyber war and web wars, as you put it. And obviously you go into some detail about how it operates in China and in different countries and so on as well. But I wanted to kind of turn it around and ask your view about the West. What are the responsibilities of the technology companies in particular? I mean, because increasingly, and this runs into the whole surveillance question as well. But what do you think is the role of Western technology companies in ensuring an open web and open access to information?
Well, I think that there's this wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Rebecca McKinnon, that looks at some of these issues, and she's coined this wonderful term, Facebookistan, which is this autocratic virtual country ruled by Facebook, where they determine, this is a public space, but they determine according to their own rules what can be made public and what cannot be made public. So they have enormous power, and these companies have tremendous power to determine what information is available to us in the public sphere. And they have different business strategies that really determine the way they approach these issues. And most of them are American. And so we know now that that they have relationships with the U.S. government and with the intelligence community, and that gives the U.S. a strategic advantage in terms of the kind of cyber warfare that's going on, at a constant drumbeat in the background. So, I think that we have to recognize that this technology has created a new environment that's transformed the way we live our lives and the way we communicate and the way we share information, but the power that it has granted these companies is immense, and we have to figure out a way. The companies clearly have a responsibility for this, for maintaining freedom of expression standards at a global level. And most of the time, they're interested in doing this, but not always. And the second point I would point out is, there are two sort of pivot points on this issue. One is the companies themselves and the responsibility they have, but the other is the governments around the world. So I talked about the people who bring us the news. Well, the systems that bring us the news, which is essentially this technology, is also under threat.
So this is net neutrality and wish to the corporate web.
Net neutrality is. Net neutrality is an important debate, but I think it's a bit of a distraction when you look at this issue in a global context. And there, the central point is about internet governance. And the system of internet governance that we have, it's a pretty boring, mind-numbing kind of thing where there's this multi-stakeholder approach where all these different sectors have a say in how the internet is governed, but it's highly decentralized and it's harder for governments to manage information. They can sweep it up. That's not too difficult to do if you're the U.S., but it's harder to control or manage. And this is frustrating to many governments, particularly China. And these governments want a new system of internet governance that are more accountable to the governments themselves. They think the UN is the right vehicle to create this. And if they're successful, we could have an environment in which the internet itself as a shared global resource is and different people around the world will have access to different information. This is already happening, but it could become more pronounced. And that's a real threat to this system that I talked about of the underpinnings of the information age, in which the access to this essential information will be even more skewed and even more disproportionately distributed.
So that leads us on into the question of surveillance and the Edward Snowden revelations and so on. And you make the point in the book about the potential chilling effect, or the real chilling effect that has over journalism, the need for information security and so on as well. But also how that, in a sense, has pulled the rug from under, particularly the US, but Western countries wanting to take the high ground over free speech.
Yeah. I mean, how many people, just quick show of hands, at least give a thought when you send an email or communicate electronically about the integrity of that information and who's... I mean, I think it's pretty right? I mean, everybody thinks about this, and if you're a journalist and you're dealing in highly sensitive information and you have made commitments to protect your sources, journalists, I think, wonder whether, they could say, well, I'm going to go to jail to protect my sources. You may not need to make that decision, because just emailing your source may compromise. And the U.S. government has actually said, we're not going to need to subpoena journalists anymore. They've said this privately. We can if we want to figure out who you're talking to, we have ways. So, it's a new environment as far as surveillance is concerned. And there's been a lot of focus, rightly, on the NSA revelations and the scope of NSA spying. And I think this is understandable, and I'm very concerned about this, and we've been advocating with President Obama to create some sort of limits on the ability of a journalist organization. We're obviously concerned about this issue across the board, but we're focusing on ways to limit the government's ability to spy journalists. We don't know what those... But I want to make another point, which is about the normative reality. So surveillance is like drones, okay? So in that the technology now is dominated by a handful of governments with the technological capacity to exploit this kind of surveillance. But it will be disseminated to almost every country. This capacity will grow at the national level across the world. And I think the surveillance issue is going to become, it's just going to become more and more difficult. And I think it's an uphill battle to make sure that we can secure our information.
But it also sort of redefines, or perhaps just brings into focus the relationship between the state and independent journalism. And in the UK here, we've had an issue not with high-tech surveillance, but with the police basically simply grabbing the phone records of journalists without telling them. And it's not particularly high-tech, and they don't have to go to a court or anyone else to do it. Legislation, and that's really about a culture that says journalists are fair game. We don't have to respect their independence if we don't want to, and that feels to me as if there is a kind of a culture from Western governments and doubtless others as well that's
it has a normative impact. And I mean, you have to realize the power of this information. I mean, the thing that drove this home to me, I remember, and this was. In 2009, following the elections in Iran, the disputed elections, Mazhar Bahari, I'm sure many of you know him, he lives here in London. He was working for Newsweek and Channel 4, and he was arrested and interrogated and held for a couple months in prison. And when he got out, I asked him, what kinds of things did they ask you about? And he was like, first thing they want to know is the password. They want to go to Facebook. They want to see who your friends are. And when you think about what the average person puts on Facebook, this is, it's who your friends are, what your interests are, your network. I mean, this is exactly the that interrogators used to pull your fingernails out to get. Right? I mean, they just get your password. They see who you're communicating with on Facebook. That you've just given them a gold mine. And everyone has celebrated the ways in which this technology has been used to create networks, but it can also be used by repressive governments to dismantle networks. And we're seeing that increasingly in many instances around the world.
So another of those paradoxes. I want to touch on impunity, and then before we open up, touch on some of the moves that are being taken to address some of these issues. So, impunity. I think it's something like 9 out of 10 murders of journalists never get properly investigated or never get prosecutions, never come to court or anything of that kind. It's a global problem, obviously particularly acute in certain countries. I mean, it's now on the UN's agenda. We have, I think it's November the 2nd, a day to end impunity. There's discussion in UNESCO and other groups about trying to build kind of greater support for ending impunity. But in the end, is the scale of the problem something that can be addressed at that intergovernmental level realistically? How much difference do these sort of high-level policy discussions ever going to make on the ground?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is recognize that this is not just a problem that confronts national governments, that the journalists who are being killed, the frontline journalists, we talked a little bit about the new system of information that informs the global community, which is us. These journalists are part of that information ecosystem. They are the frontline reporters gathering information in Russia, in the Philippines, in Mexico. There's a horrible drug war taking place in Brazil, in Pakistan, so many places around the world. The information ecosystem is being, these journalists are an essential part of that, and they're the ones being killed. So this is all of our problems. These people are not marginal to the system, they're integral. And this also includes freelancers who are playing an increasing role because, again, the technology has changed this dramatically. So it's in the one sense, I think it's very positive that there is a UN a program that recognizes their essential role and that the international community has come together and at least acknowledged that we all have a stake. But it's a long haul. It's a long haul, and this is this. I was talking to my colleague Elizabeth Witchell, who I think is here somewhere. There's Elizabeth, and she's sort of led our work in this area at CPJ, and but there has been some progress. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that there have been some convictions. I think in 2013 there were 8 convictions, which is a very high number. There were some really important ones last year, including a Pakistani journalist who was murdered, Wali Khan Babar. It was the first time that they convicted a killer in those cases. So you have to take the long view. I don't want to. I certainly claim that the level of UN engagement has changed the dynamic, but I do think it's positive, and I'm seeing small bits of progress in certain parts of the world.
And some, I mean, Colombia is an obvious example. Some places, some countries have improved, and there may be multiple reasons for that. There was a session last year which William Horsley, I think, helped to organise at the BBC, where the New York Times lawyer said he felt there should be a targeted approach, a bit like there was in the civil rights cases in the United States 40, 50 years ago. You pick the cases you can win, and then you start to build success.
Well, that's absolutely what we're doing, and we pick emblematic cases. I mean, they are difficult, but I mean, if you look at the Anna Politkovskaya case, I mean, she's become quite emblematic. And for those of you who don't know her, I mean, I think she's sort of become a worldwide icon. She was a Russian journalist who was killed in 2007. Had reported aggressively on the North Caucasus and corruption and the Putin administration, and she was executed. And there've been fits. The case has moved in fits and starts. I would not in any way suggest that there's been justice, but there has been some progress, and there has been some of the lower level people involved in the crime have been convicted. And I think none of that would have happened without international attention. I mean, we know what a difficult environment Russia is. So I do think that that's exactly the right strategy. And I think that there has been, some of these cases that we've selected and worked on, we have seen incremental progress. So I think we need to recognize that.
Okay, then finally, before we open it up, I mean, you define a lot of these kind of issues here, and then at the end you start to look at what might be done around them. So just give us some of your thoughts on, how the scale of this problem might start to be addressed.
Well, I sort of have a 10-point plan, and I think that rather than hear about my 10-point plan, you'd probably want to ask questions. But so let me just take one point.
Okay.
And that is that I believe that the battle for freedom of expression, and it's really a battle for freedom of expression, not just freedom of the press, because journalists operate in a environment that protects the rights of everyone to express their ideas freely is the defining struggle of our time, for the reason we live in the information age. Information is the kind of engine, as I mentioned, in the global economy. We need to have a system, and it's under threat. This system is under threat. So what we need to do is form a grand coalition of all the disparate forces that have a stake in ensuring that information flows freely. And these are kind of strange bedfellows. They're not just the journalism community, and the journalism community has its own flaws and shortcomings, but I think in general is committed to this and has advocated. But really, we haven't built alliances with other sectors, including international business, including the tech community, including international NGOs, including like-minded governments. What we need to do is think broadly about what are the interests that that benefit from the free flow of information at a global level, and how can we build a united front to advocate for this essential right. And then I talk about the things, once you build this coalition, specific things you can do. But if you have questions about that, let's leave it to the Q&A.
Great. Well, that's a great point then to open it up. Yep. And if you could just give us an indication of who you are, if you have a particular perspective on it, interest.
Thank you. Hello, that was really fascinating. Thank you very much, and I look forward to reading your book. Katherine Davies from Iguazu. We're a global public platform designed to help the public confused about what's an effective action to take in places like Syria and South Sudan and want to help but don't know what to do, and we give them advice about effective actions. I was in Juba in November, and I was in a state of shock on my return about how I couldn't talk about what I saw, and I couldn't take photographs of what I saw. So it was quite shocking to have this first-hand experience of no freedom of expression at all. And it's about what's happening at the international level, and it's in respect to what you were just finishing with on a need for a grand coalition. I'm curious about what's happening at the international level of lobbying, at the UN level and things like that. When there are international and regional efforts, cooperative efforts at trying to resolve a conflict, is there somebody representing the importance of freedom of expression in that room? It seems to be such a critical element of conflict resolution, and I wonder which that is an enshrined place in that space.
Yeah. It's not enshrined. That's clear to me. There are individuals within the UN system who are advocating more aggressively for the role of information, both within conflict resolution and within as an engine for development. And this was discussed in the context of the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, which there was a push to include freedom of expression in those goals and set benchmarks around there. It doesn't look like that is in the cards, but it was part of the discussion. I mean, I think it's a really valuable point, but I don't think that there's any systematic effort to ensure that the free flow of information. There are definitely very important NGOs working in this space. I think of the Hirondelle Project. I think of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. But I don't see it within the UN system, and certainly in a systematic way.
We've got a question in the corner there.
Hi there, thank you very much for your talk this evening. Very interesting, lots of themes obviously to pick up from that. My name is Christopher Jackson, I'm from a company called Elder Street. My question really was, you spoke about the theme of utility in your discussion.
Yeah.
And my question, I guess, would be, is the changing utility of journalists moving away from perhaps traditional media platforms whereby they were the sort of primary provider of information to the public towards a more multifaceted system where in fact anybody can be a journalist, has devalued journalists as individuals, and therefore their declining utility makes this, as you say, perhaps less of an issue about journalism and more of a wider issue of general expression. And if that is the case, my question really is, does this then mean that this trend of increasing repression of journalism and increasing threats towards journalists in these countries in the world is one that actually will continue to get worse and worse, irrespective of specific journalist measures, until that wider issue of freedom of expression changes? And that's my question.
Wow, you don't need to read my book because you've just summarized my argument. That's exactly that's exactly what I'm arguing. Yes, I mean the journalists, not individual journalists, but collectively, they exercise this information monopoly. That was the source of their power. That was the source of their power. Whether you were a celebrity, or whether you're dealing with a democratic leader, or whether you're dealing with a rebel movement, or whether you're dealing with a repressive government. And that has been completely upended by the technology. And so as you say, the value of journalists as individuals is diminished, and that makes them more vulnerable. And I believe that's one of the reasons we're seeing the spike in violence and the spike in repression. So I think you have to deal with this in a systematic way, and you have to take a long view. But the only point where I would diverge is I think it's very hard to predict the future when it comes to this technology. Things can change in a hurry. We don't know what direction things are going to head. But certainly, if you look at the trends, and again, I have this graph that I always point to, with more and more people coming online, this global information revolution taking place, and what correlates with that is rising levels of violence against journalists, declining levels of press freedom around the world. This is the paradox. This is the paradox, and at the moment, there's no easy way out.
I mean, journalists are becoming less influential, but simultaneously more vulnerable. That is a
Correct.
paradox in a way, isn't it?
Well, that's.
Yeah.
I mean, look. I mean, you've been in these situations many times. When you were in a rough spot as a journalist, right? The central argument you made to the bad guys was, I'm useful to you. That's really what the argument you made, and you would. I imagine. Who knows what Daniel Pearl said, to his captors? But I imagined he said, "If you kill me, who's going to tell your story? If you're killing journalists, then there's no one to tell your story." They didn't care, and if you try and make that, if you're captured by ISIS and you try and make that argument, I would imagine you get laughed out of the room.
Yeah.
But that used to be the argument that journalists made. That was, and people talk about, when it comes to journalists, respect for international humanitarian law, and all that's true. But I think the essential that kept journalists safe in certainly in conflict zones, but also reporting in repressive environments, was their essential utility, and that you needed a certain component of the press. Even if it was the Soviet Union, I mean, the press was managed in a different way, but the government needed the press to communicate with the population and also with a global audience. They don't need them anyway.
Okay,
anymore.
We had another question at the back here, and then down here, and then we'll come to the front. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Lucas Rapp. I'm just a student. My question would be more on a case, because you were talking about examples like in Russia and another country, but we are not even able to have like a progress here in Europe. If you see, for example, Hungary, it's a thing that goes on for years and somehow no one cares. And I would be just curious how, like, your comment on this is, if we are not able to have like a press freedom in Europe, how we want to have it in other countries.
Yeah, well, I would say Orban is venturing into the democratator camp. I mean, in terms of the strategies that he's employing, this sort of embrace of a liberal democracy. I mean, definitely, Hungary represents a fundamental challenge to Europe and to EU values, and to the system that's been developed to ensure that EU members uphold their commitments, because the EU as an institution has been unable to apply significant pressure on Hungary, despite the fact that they basically mocked these commitments. So we are actually doing a CPJ, a report this year on the EU and the challenges that it's facing both internally in terms of safeguarding freedom of expression and upholding these values, and its influence regionally. So I absolutely share your concern, and I think what's happening in Hungary is extremely troubling for the reasons you mentioned.
My name's Tom Jeffrey. I'm news editor at the News Hub. We're an open journalism platform. Question. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. Just a quick question about North and South divisions within journalism.
Yeah.
And what's to be done about the new censorship. I think it's very clear that there's still a division of labour, right, between northern journalists and southern journalists. So the work that your kind of Western correspondent does and the local fixer is still very different. There's still a much different calculus of risk as well, right? So the difference between getting Peter Grest out of prison and getting Baha Mohammed out of prison in Egypt is very different. I'm just wondering how you sort of address that kind of different calculus of risk.
Well, I mean, I think you're right in your analysis, although I think the gap has actually closed quite a bit in that not because I actually think 10 years ago that Baha Mohammed might have been in prison, but they would never have put Peter Greste in prison for a year. I actually think that some of the risks that international journalists who once sort of saw themselves as untouchable in this way, they actually, or what's happening in Syria. So the gap between them in terms of risk is actually narrowed somewhat. And while I don't have any easy solutions to the problem as you frame it, I do want to say, when I was I guess this was quite a while ago, when I was a correspondent in Latin America, I covered Mexico mostly. One of the dirty secrets of journalism is that, we used to just sit there and read the local press. We'd go to the cafe in the morning, we'd get like 20 newspapers, we'd just sit and read them, and then like half of our sources were the local journalists because they knew everything and they could explain it to us, and then we kind of all sort of did fundamentally the same story, for different media organizations. Like I would make my money as a freelancer doing the same story 4 times for 4 different publications, and everyone thought that was dandy, and I could get paid a lot more because I was doing the same exact story and selling it to 4 different, that's gone, right, because the technology makes that impossible. And that whole process that I was engaged in, that was basically my value added as a freelancer who knew the country and spoke the language, that's also been completely upended by technology. So what that means is that the local journalists who were the source of a lot of the international reporting indirectly are now, again, part of this global media, global information ecosystem. We're all actually swimming in the same ocean. And I think, you're right that that those folks bring is not recognized. But I think that's the framing that we have to have, is we have to try and break down that barrier. We have to recognize that they're part of this shared system. We have to recognize that our ability to be informed depends on ensuring that they have the ability to exercise their job, their work with some modicum of safety. That's certainly the fundamental guiding principle of the Committee to Protect Journalists where I work.
Great, thanks. I've got a question at the front, and then William. Yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
Just go. Yeah, just go for it.
You, so I don't know about.
Doesn't sound like
Yeah.
it. Okay. Hi, that's better.
That's better.
My name is Kathleen O'Hara. I'm with an online progressive news service in Canada, rabble.ca, as in Rabble browsers. I was wondering if you're looking at democratators, sort of second or third tier.
Yeah.
Our Prime Minister has, we have a terrible Prime Minister. He rarely has press conferences.
I'm strictly neutral.
Our access to information has gone from top in the world to below many countries, considered dangerous. Our CBC is being dismantled, and we now have Bill C-51 in Parliament. I'm glad you know.
I'm married to a Canadian. My wife's Canadian.
Right.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in Canada.
But I mean, these are the democratators that I'm just wondering if you're talking about them, because I think this is sort of more stealthy.
Yeah.
But equally dangerous because they're not in the spotlight. So I just wondered if you could comment.
Yeah, I was recently in Toronto to talk about my book, and I talked about this whole democratator theory, and a bunch of people at that thing said, "You're describing Harper. This is exactly how it works." I'm not willing to go there. That's really not what I had in mind when because I think that you. Of Harper, I wouldn't put him in the same camp as Putin or Hugo Chavez, but it was interesting to me that when I described this, it resonated with a lot of the Canadians in that audience. Now I know that Harper also has his supporters who would have a different, but I did find it interesting that some of the tactics that I was describing seemed familiar to my friends in Canada. I mean, I will also say this, some of the democratator tactics, I definitely, again, I'm not equating President Obama with, or Cameroon with any of these other folks that I've described, but certainly some of the tactics that they're employing have a certain resonance. For example, in the United States, the Obama administration has been quite aggressive in marginalizing the media, in basically developing alternative strategies of communicating with its supporters and with the American public. And some of these things are really kind of creepy. Like they produce their own news programs. I think they call it West Wing Week or something, and they publish it, put it up on the web. It looks like a news program, and the way they restrict access, they restrict the professional media they don't even give them pool access to photograph events. The White allow the White House photographer in, and then they take those images and push them out to the public and make them available to the news media. So again, there's a continuum. I don't think I would put, some of the people you described, but it is interesting that people recognize some of these strategies.
Yeah, good, William.
I'm William Horsley. Joel, I wonder what you think the impact of the Charlie Hebdo thing is overall in the way that governments play the game and also the public perceptions of journalists, because it seems to me this was the biggest shock. It was the biggest display of press freedom ever seen in Europe or perhaps anywhere in the world. But at the same time, the immediate aftermath is a lot of governments saying we need more powers of surveillance and so on. So sidelining, downgrading of journalists. And you have the view of one senior economist editor that if Greenwald came to London, he would march him off to the nearest police station. That kind of idea that national security comes first. And this is now quite a pervasive view within the media themselves. The Snoopers Charter here in the UK is going to go through more easily. So I wonder how you think that's playing out. Is it going to pass, or is this part of a longer trend in which governments do have the whip hand?
Well, I mean, what was interesting, I definitely think certainly in Europe and among free expression advocates, there was this moment, in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attack where the issue had tremendous resonance, and I think the people in France certainly part of their self-identity is this tradition of satire and mocking criticism, and they kind of embrace that in the moment. But then the next day, Hollande had this march through the streets of Paris to show solidarity. And if you look at who showed up for that march, that was not a freedom of expression solidarity march. That was a national security march. I mean, if you look at the leadership that was there. And included, representatives from the Russian government, included Prime Minister Davutoglu from Turkey, and that is, I think the freedom of expression coalition lasted a couple of days, and it's been replaced by a national security coalition. And I think that, Cameron certainly took advantage of the mood here. I think he immediately proposed, in the aftermath of the attack, efforts to expand state surveillance, the ability of state to monitor communication. So I think that there was an instinctive emotional response that caused people to come together, at least in France, to celebrate freedom of expression. But that has been replaced and driven by fear by a new national security paradigm, which I think is a grave threat to those very same values.
Okay, there's a question behind you, William. Nobody on this side of the room yet. Oh, we're going to get you there in a minute. Good, okay, I'll come to you next. So there was a question immediately behind William, yeah?
Thank you very much. There's been a very interesting talk. I've just got a quick question about the way that social media and the pressures on journalistic budgets sort of almost go hand in hand. As obviously the media struggles to, especially printed media, struggles to find new ways of funding itself, and therefore there's pressures on journalists to do their jobs and to produce stories. We see more and more stories about what is going on social media, whether it's there was a Twitter storm here or what's going on a footballer's Instagram, and stories like that. Whereas in the past we've seen regimes take a rather blunt instrument approach of when there's something on social media they don't like, by shutting down access to it. Do you think there'll be more of a soft touch approach where it's just almost with the collaboration or the acquiesce of the corporations that run media programs, muting a hashtag here or seeing it quietly suspending an account there to nip things in the bud? And I'm thinking sort of the way that Google was willing in the past to censor search results, perhaps Twitter allowing itself, or platforms like Twitter allowing itself to be censored in that way, which means that journalists won't be able to report on those those things.
Yeah, I mean the way that people, there's a certain either or framework that I reject, in which some people talk about this golden age spawned by technology, and some people talk about the golden age we had 30 years ago when journalists were sort of information gatekeepers, and I sort of reject both views, and my argument is that we need an intersection of both of these forces. Like sometimes a lot of stories gain global, and this is the system that frankly the Islamic State has exploited. Something breaks on social media, but it really reaches the mass when that story is picked up by traditional media, which still delivers most of the eyeball section between these two systems, and they both have to function fairly well in order for us to get the news that we need. So there's a complexity in the system that create some structural challenges. But to get to your point, I mean, I think what we're living in an age of just-in-time censorship. Again, if you look at the democratators as sort of the leading edge of this new repressive strategy, it's not a blunt instrument in the same way it once was. Even in, the government, is constantly doing a risk analysis, a threat analysis, and deciding what kind of information threatens its interests, and then censoring that information. And the system, as it exists, actually allows that to be done effectively. Sometimes with the cooperation either willing or through pressure of some of these technology companies. But that is the dynamic that I see emerging. Not sweeping censorship, but just-in-time targeted censorship using the technology itself and new systems of control to create the impression. Like if you ask most average people in China, are you able to, is your experience on the web censored? They probably would say, I don't know, and I don't really care. I get what I need. I can find the information I need. They're not even really aware. There's a certain segment of the population that's much more engaged, that understands how censorship works. But I think that's the new paradigm. That is the new paradigm where censorship is targeted and responsive to the specific threat that the state has identified.
I'm Flora. I used to work here at the Frontline Club, and now I work at the World Service at the BBC. I'm going to ask two questions, I'm afraid. One philosophical and one more practical.
Okay.
The first thing is about press freedom as an absolute good, or freedom of expression.
Yes.
I wonder what your take is on the decision here by Ofcom, the regulator, to take press TV off air, for example, and to speak a bit more about the alternative narratives like Russia Today that are pervading the internet. I mean, how many YouTube subscribers do they have now? They're really out there, and they have a lot more money than other more liberal press outlets. And the second question is about the dark net and what future you see there for Tor hidden services, not just for journalists but also for the public, because we're not just being followed by governments but by corporations in everything we do online. So what's your take on that?
Okay, so on the first point is freedom of expression in unalloyed good, and what do I think about the Ofcom decision to bump press TV? You know, I mean, if you look at the Ofcom, first of all, I know Mazhar Buhari, who pushed for this, and I respect him a great deal, and I understand the anguish that Press TV caused him by airing this forced confession, which was completely bogus, and it was horrible, and I can point to other really horrific things that Press TV has done. You know, if I choose to look at it within the narrow confines of Ofcom as a state regulator, I can defend it. I can defend it. I understand that, what Press TV did was absolutely horrific, was in violation of the regulation that Ofcom was created to uphold. But if I take I'm not that excited about it. It troubles me. This is in full recognition, obviously, of what Press TV represents. I still think that, if we're going to effectively advocate for freedom of expression at a global level, which I think is ultimately the only system that works. I understand that, it's a truism that unadulterated speech creates problems and challenges, but the solution is generally not to restrict that speech, but to challenge it. I mean, certainly in the ideal framework, that's what we want to do, including at a global level. So I'm never about it. It always makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But and I think one of the things I propose in the book is that we need a clear international definition of incitement to violence. Incitement to violence is not protected speech. It should never be protected speech. But the problem is that there's no standard international definition of what kinds of speech crosses into this line and when it's not protected. So governments exploit this lack of clarity to crack down on critical speech, and sometimes speech that clearly is incitement to violence. There's no measure within, there's no internationally sanctioned measure to remove that speech and eliminate it. So that's the answer to the first part. The second part about the dark web, I think your question is what is is it a sort of potential resource for free expression because the web is so monitored and controlled. I had a dinner in New York a couple weeks ago with some Google executives who work on freedom of expression issues. And they told me that from a sort of corporate business vantage point, they were very concerned that the internet was becoming polluted. That the internet is the environment in which Google operates, right? I mean, Google, people's willingness to surf the web and to search, which is Google's, the way Google monetizes, is dependent on people having basic trust in the web itself. And that trust is eroding, and that's a threat to their business model. And I think that that's a larger reality that we all have to confront. And so ultimately, I think the dark web is kind of a response to this, to a certain extent. To people mistrust the web for different reasons. Some mistrust it because of they're afraid that they're going to get attacked. some mistrust it because they feel that the government or companies is lurking everywhere and they want to avoid that. But ultimately, the system will only function. I basically agree with their analysis if people have confidence in the web itself and that experience, and that the dark web ideally is a response to the current reality, but I think as a long-term strategy, it's going to advance the cause of freedom of expression.
So that pollution on the
Yeah.
web is multiple causes. And
Yes.
so what if you're interested in information that you can trust, whether you're Google or whether you're a free speech campaigner, what can people do about pollution?
Yeah, well, it's immensely complex. I mean, I think that the web experience has evolved to the point where we totally depend on it. We depend on this information, and we depend on the, on this technology. But increasingly we don't trust it, and increasingly it's risky. So I think that restoring that. I mean, I don't have any immediate answers to how we restore that trust. I mean, there are certain things that we can clearly do. One is to limit the government surveillance and their ability to surveil. One is to companies are more transparent in terms of their interactions with their users. The other is to develop technological solutions that protect people more effectively from some of the risks associated with being active on the web. So there are different strategies that we need to employ, but this is a complex question, and it's not going to be solved by one single action.
Absolutely. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, there was a question there at the back.
Thank you. Hi, I've got two questions for you. The first one being about the disrespect amongst journalism, perhaps, or the lowering respect. When I went to an activism workshop, the first thing I was taught was there's no such thing as off the record, and how much responsibility can you put upon journalists themselves for that lowering of respect, that breakdown in those relationships between, perhaps whistleblowers and journalists, and how many times has that happened now for journalists not to be trusted and not seen as sort of a useful resource for those trying to fight for their cause. And is about hackers and the use of hacktivism in degrading censorship. So looking at the Arab Spring and how it was actually hackers that got people connected to the internet so they could share videos and their stories about what was going on there.
Okay, so let's take the lowering of respect for journalists. I mean, it's interesting that you cite as an example the journalists. Somebody saying off the record, there's no such thing as off the record, because for some journalists and some media critics, the willingness of journalists to engage in off the record conversations compromises journalism. Particularly when you're talking about talking to people in power, who can manipulate journalists in ways through these kinds of off the record. So there's some people who advocate, for journalists to avoid having off the record conversations wherever possible. So it's interesting that you see that as a sign of lack of trustworthiness. But I mean, I think your larger point is well taken. And again, this goes back to, if you're involved in a cause, and the question you're going to ask yourself in your relationship with the media is, how can the media advance my cause? I mean, that's a logical answer, and journalists understand that. I mean, when they're engaging with activists, they understand that they have a role to play, and that the people who have a cause want to use journalists to advance that cause. So then the question becomes really what I was talking about: how useful? How useful are journalists when you have a cause? And are there other means at your disposal, including the ones you described, of communicating? I mean, maybe you want to communicate by generating some sort of campaign on social media and then hoping the traditional media picks that up rather than engaging with the media directly, and that's an option that you now have. But it all comes back to this issue of how useful is the media, how useful to you in trying to achieve the specific objectives that you've set, and how useful is the media for governments, and how because the media and their ability to interact with all these forces and do this with integrity depends on journalists feeling that they have some control in these situations. So that's what I think has fundamentally changed. In terms of the role of, I mean, I'm not sure where hacktivists come into the Arab Spring. I mean, I definitely see more of sort of a social media and citizen journalism was very much a part of that dynamic, and I think it sort of reached its pinnacle at that point. I mean, it's the way that I experienced the Tahrir Square uprising. I was thinking about the way I experienced like critical media events during my lifetime, and that was the first time I basically I sat at my desk. I really never turned the TV on. Sometimes I'd stream Al Jazeera because they had like a live stream you could get on the web at the time. But mostly, I followed that through social media, and you could find people who were eyewitnesses who were in Tahrir Square who were observing what was happening, and linking to other folks who were providing information, and you could follow moment by moment, and you would go to like a website, say the New York Times website, the same way you might have gone to like a weekly magazine 30 years ago, which was to get like a little context and analysis, because if you were engaging through social media, you had that option to kind of be on the scene through vicariously. So, but I think that was a unique event in that the world was transfixed. The world wanted this information moment by moment, and the nature of the events lent itself to that kind of reporting. So I don't know if we're ever going to have an event that's quite like that, but certainly we know that social media and this kind of eyewitness observation, which again, it brings everyone into this kind of information ecosystem, from just witnesses who happen to see things to activists, human rights activists. You use the social media in a very effective way. It brings them into this system, but I think that the Tahrir Square uprising and the Arab Spring generally represented a specific moment in time when this system was novel and exciting, and the events were perfectly conducive to this kind of coverage.
The problem with that, Joe, is because I think there are other events like that. I remember doing something similar in 2009 with the Green protests in Iran. Yeah. You could say the Boston bombings, a lot of people followed on social media. But you need a degree of kind of social media literacy, and you probably need to know something about Egyptian politics or Iranian politics to be able to filter out the hoaxes and the... It can be fantastically effective, but it puts a big onus to understand what it is that they're doing and to filter it.
And that's exactly what I was saying. In that system, then the websites become the nightly news. Yeah. Or the weekly, in other words, they synthesize and contextualize this information. But if you want to experience it firsthand, you have that opportunity. Actually, I think the Boston Marathon bombing and the aftermath of that is a great example. But what I'm saying is, I think there was a moment when people thought, oh, everyone's just going to follow the news on social media. But it's more like you have people use it. It's a lot of work. Yeah. So people tend to rely on it when there's some crucial event that they want to follow moment by moment.
Great. Okay, time for another kind of final question or two, if anyone's got them. Last chance to go around the room. Yep, another one at the back there before we wrap up.
As you kindly offered another question. Yep. I guess my last question would be, if we're talking about the internet as it potentially is a global commons for free access to information. Yeah. And if I'm not being entirely unfair, I think you've taken a somewhat pessimistic outlook on the current state of play within that sort of global commons, or at least the trajectory of that global commons. Well, I guess I would ask is what your views were then on sites like Wikipedia, for example, which has been quite an interesting forum, admittedly not of necessarily live news content, although admittedly the updates of a lot of the actions themselves have been quite active. But it certainly seems platforms like that do show that there is mechanisms within the web that actually are relatively objective, perhaps is dangerous, but at least subjective to lots of people being able to express their will and opinion, and at least acknowledges where points are contested. And my question would be, could you not see a proliferation of alternative platforms like that going forward that actually do keep the sort of global commons and the idea of a free global commons alive?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's a very, very, very good question. And I'm not just saying that. I'm not as pessimistic, I think, as you. I mean, basically, what I'm saying is that I actually put tremendous value in the system. I think it's been tremendously. It's been transformative, and Wikipedia is a great example of the system. Sort of a high functioning part of this system. What I'm suggesting is that just because Wikipedia is working pretty well, and actually very well, we shouldn't be complacent. We have to recognize the threats to the system, and we have to recognize that the information is provided by people, and those people are more vulnerable than ever. So I think my central point about this is, this system that we have today, which I characterize as hybrid. So you're sort of going down this which of these systems is going to win out. I don't really care. I mean, I don't really care how we get this information. I just believe that this information is essential. And right now, we're living in a hybrid moment where both systems interact with each other, and they both have to function reasonably well in order for us to get the information we need. And I think you pointed to a very good example where this kind of internet ecology is quite healthy. But my argument is that we can't count on that, and we can't count on technology to save us. We can't. This is not just a battle over technology. This is not something where we can sit back and go, okay, they'll figure out some technological solution and the information will continue to flow. I don't believe that. I believe that that this is part of the why it's so important to have this global freedom of expression coalition. It's a recognition of what's at stake, a recognition that the individuals who are bringing us news and information have never been more vulnerable, a recognition of our obligation to them as news consumers to support their work and advocate on their behalf, and a recognition that the system that we depend on, the internet as a shared global resource, is also. And that's really my central message, and that's what I hope that all of you take away from this discussion this evening.
And that would have been a great point to end on, but we have a final question.
Okay. It's kind of winding up.
You're a pro. I can tell. Yeah.
All right.
Very last one.
As you said, journalists are less the gatekeepers than they used to be, and maybe with revenues dropping, do you think that self-censorship to please advertisers such as HSBC might be on the rise?
Do you know about the HSBC story here?
I don't think I've been following.
Okay, there's a suggestion. Peter Oborn, the Frontline member club member, was a columnist for the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah.
Protest because he said they'd suppress the HSBC.
Right. Oh yes. Okay. Well, look. Again, one of the strengths that the media had in this imperfect system was that it was a strong institution, and that as an institution, it had the ability, it didn't always exercise this ability, to confront power and resist power. And that's valuable. It's not always used in the way you'd like it to be used, particularly if you have an activist perspective. But I think we benefit from having institutions that are independent, strong enough to take this position. I think the ability of the media as an institution has been weakened. I mean, the position has been weakened by the by technology and the impact that's had on the media business, and so their ability to play this role, while it still exists and it's still important, it's diminished, and so that's one. And I don't think there's any putting that genie back in the bottle. I don't, and I think there were there were impacts of having these strong institutions, that were the result of, again, this kind of information monopoly that was collectively exercised. I don't know if we want to go back to that system, but we, to an extent, we miss that. We miss having those strong institutions, and I think that your analysis is correct, that in an environment in which the economic position of media is weakened, they're more to these kinds of pressure.
Great. Joel, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic discussion. The book's for sale here. I can urge you to buy it, not because I'm on commission, but because I can genuinely say it's a really great read. So if you haven't got a copy, please pick one up. But meanwhile, Joel, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation.